The framework of 6 historical thinking concepts is now used as a model for teaching history. Developed and coordinated by Peter Zasius and Jill Collier, these concepts have been integrated into the social studies, history, and geography curriculum guidelines in several provinces and territories across Canada. The main idea behind the historical thinking concepts was to design a new approach to history education that would help to shift how teachers teach social studies, history, and geography, and how students learn, to focus on developing critical thinking skills beyond the regurgitation of historical dates, and to disrupt the entrenched Eurocentricity in Canadian history. The structuring of history education using these concepts to encourage inquiry-based teaching and learning does allow for more room to include Black historical narratives. However, educators can still replicate Eurocentric content if inclusion of Black history is not deliberate. What does this pedagogical shift to inquiry-based teaching and learning mean for the teaching of Black history? How can the 6 historical thinking concepts support the increased integration of African Canadian stories? What are some important considerations for thinking historically about the lives of people of African descent in the territory now called Canada? This webinar will walk through these guiding questions. In most provinces, with the exception of Nova Scotia and one learning expectation on the Underground Railroad in Alberta, there were and continues to be no specific learning expectations on African Canadian history. The historical thinking concepts provide the space and opportunity to include more stories, perspectives, and experiences. The first concept, which is important to guide our learning and teaching, is historical significance. Which Black people are remembered, researched, and taught, and who is not remembered, and why? Which Black people should be remembered? This question is important in thinking about Canadian versus American representation of Black people. It has often been said that the Black history taught in Canada tends to focus on African Americans as opposed to African Canadians. Another question is the focus on people who tend to be more celebrated and more known versus everyday people. The second concept is evidence. In this case, what primary sources can be used to learn more about African Canadian history? There are many common sources that can be used in our classrooms, such as newspapers, letters, petitions, and photos. Some things to think about as you seek evidence and primary sources to use in your classrooms include: why is some evidence not viewed as credible? Do we accept various forms of evidence, such as oral histories? In communities that tended to be colonized by Europeans, oral histories are strong sources of historical evidence and information. How are these treated in our history classrooms? Another question is the evidence credible and adequate to support the conclusions reached in regards to African Canadian history? The third concept is continuity and change. How have the social conditions of Black life remained the same over time? One important factor to consider is racism. Another question is, how have these social conditions changed? When we chart the course of anti-Black racism in Canadian history and globally, more broadly, we can trace back to the transatlantic slave trade. Over the course of over 400 years, what remains the same about racism? How has it changed over time? And another question to consider is, how has Black activism remained the same or changed over time in response to the racism that they faced? The next concept is cause and consequence. Why did historical events happen the way they did, and what were the consequences for Black Canadians? Why were Black Canadians excluded from public spaces? Spaces such as public schools, restaurants, theaters, and hotels. What beliefs about Black people informed their treatment by white Canadians? How did Black Canadians respond to and challenge the circumstances that they faced? of their exclusion. For example, why did the demolition of Africville in Nova Scotia happen? The fifth concept is historical perspective. What does the past look like when viewed through the lenses of African Canadians of the time? What were the social, cultural, and political contexts of the particular time that you are looking at that shaped the lives and actions of Black Canadians in the past? What were the perspectives of Black women, the perspectives of Black men, the perspectives of Black children? What about the Black working class and the Black middle class? In presenting the different perspectives of African Canadians, there are several groups that can be and should be considered. For example, Black people who were enslaved under New France and British North America are one group to consider. Another are Black loyalists. These were people who gained their freedom for service in the British military during the American Revolution. A third group are free Blacks. These would have been people who were born free in the United States and who decided to migrate to Canada to live. Another group are freedom seekers from American slavery. These are individuals who were born into slavery in different places in the United States and fled their condition in order to seek freedom on Canadian soil. Another group are Black people from the Caribbean, both Anglophones and Francophones, who migrated to Canada during the late 19th century and into the 20th century. Another group are continental Africans. These are people from the countries of the continent of Africa who migrated to Canada throughout various waves in the 20th century through to today. And then there are the descendants of these different groups who were born here in Canada over the course of several generations. It's important to also consider them as another group of Black Canadians. There were various waves of Black migration into Canada, and it's important to consider the distinct ways that their reasons for coming to Canada influence their experience and perspectives as well. And then there are African Canadians today. History is still in the present, and so it's important for us to also consider the perspectives of African Canadians today. The last concept is ethical dimensions. And this concept is not always broached in our classrooms, but it is an important concept to bring to the teaching of Black Canadian history as we consider conversations around repair and restorative justice. So when looking at ethical dimensions, questions to think about are, is what happened in the past, such as enslavement, racial segregation in schools, racial segregation in the military as experienced by the No. 2 Construction Battalion, are these instances right and fair? What responsibilities to past injustices against people of African descent does Canadian society have today? Some important considerations in exploring the historical lives of African Canadians include showing the diversity of Black people. It's important to note that African Canadians are not monolithic. It's also important to take an intersectional approach to acknowledge the multitude of aspects of Black identities and how they have shaped their lives. It's important not to equate Black life with anti-Blackness. Anti-Black racism as a structure has absolutely affected Black life, but it is not the total sum of their lives. It's important to balance this important interrogation of anti-Black racism with focusing on the social lives of African Canadians, looking at their varied identities and cultures, and how they lived their lives as individuals and as communities beyond the systemic barriers that they faced. It is also important to represent Black people as historical actors with agency, that Black people deliberated and made decisions about their lives as individuals and as a collective, and that they were not just acted upon. Another consideration is to show Black people as thinkers, people with differing viewpoints amongst themselves, as people who have theorized their lives and the world and have acted accordingly within that. show African Canadians with voices, perspectives, and possessing social, philosophical, and political views as individuals as well as a collective. Be aware of and explain the historical, dated terms used in reference to Black people in documents that you will use and that students will encounter. For example, the terms Negro and colored are dated historical terms. Today, we will generally say they are similar to the term Black that we use today. And then in some historical documents, the reality is you may encounter the N-word. It's important for you to show this to your students and not to disregard them, because it's important for students to see what actually happened in our history. In thinking historically about the lives of African Canadians, these historical thinking concepts provided important guidance and tools to effectively teach about the Black experience in Canada.